Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our very first Blue Collar Ancestry event. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Sierra Green, and I work as an archivist here at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. We at the History Center have really been looking forward to facilitating this opportunity to explore your blue-collar roots. As we gather together this evening and turn our eyes to our steelworking ancestors, so many of us must be thinking of the recent news out of U.S. Steel Clairton Coke Works. The tragic loss of 2 lives this week is a somber reminder of the impact, both past and still very present, of this industry on individuals, families, and communities. So I ask you to please join me in taking a moment to reflect on those individual workers who were killed and others who were injured during yesterday's explosion. Let's also call to mind all of those workers from our region's past whose lives were inextricably shaped by the steel industry. Thank you. A couple of housekeeping remarks to begin, some of which will be relevant to all of you, others of which will be relevant to either the in-person or virtual attendees. We have live captioning provided by AI Media. We have reserved seats here for anyone who would like to have a close view of the captions. Virtual attendees, you can access the captions by clicking on the closed caption box at the bottom of your screen. This will be available throughout the evening. A note on handouts. To our virtual attendees, we will be copying a link to a Google Drive folder where each of the highlight or handouts are saved. After this event, we will be sending out emails that will contain digital copies of the handouts. So regardless of if you are here with us in person or joining us online, we highly recommend that you review these remarkable handouts that our speakers have shared with us. For our in-person attendees, y'all have printouts of each of the handouts, but I do recommend downloading digital versions so that you can use all of those hyperlinks. As for tonight's schedule, here are some of the main points. We will have 1 main lecture, followed by 3 lightning talks from local archivists who work regularly with steel records. We welcome questions for any and all of our speakers. For our virtual folks, please do submit questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In-person attendees, please submit your questions by either writing them on the slip of paper that is in your folder, and we have a box where you could submit those questions in writing. It's back by the History Center table. My colleague Matt is staffing that table as well as my colleague Margaret. Or if you're tech savvy, there is a QR code and you could submit your questions digitally. We will be collecting all of these questions and providing them to our speakers. We're going to favor questions that clarify or build off of each lecture and that are for the good of the group. Virtual attendees, if you need any tech help this evening, you can use the chat box. Please do recall too that if all else fails, this evening's event will be recorded and is going to be available after the fact on the History Center's YouTube channel. When contributing to the chat and the Q&A, we ask that you please help us maintain a supportive and positive environment. In-person attendees, there are restrooms available to your left and then straight down the hallway. We also have an emergency exit to everyone's right. And then for those also who are here with us in person, we have 2 tables staffed this evening, one by our Heinz History Center team, and that table has original materials relating to the history of the steel industry that you are welcome to flip through and take a closer look at after we break. The other table is staffed by Dr. Kirsten Payne of Rivers of Steel and also has items drawn from their collection to celebrate their work as well. Thank you all again for joining us. Now for the main event. I'd like to introduce our first and main speaker. Kate Townsend is a former professional investigator turned genealogist, specializing in Pennsylvania genealogical research. She also has experience with records from Ohio, West Virginia, and New York City, as well as expertise in immigration, naturalization, and court records. Kate owns Family History Investigations, LLC. Kate has spoken at national and local genealogical societies, libraries, and conferences, including the National Genealogical Society Family History Conference, New England Regional Genealogical Consortium, Ohio Genealogical Society Conference, and Roots Tech. Kate completed Boston University's Certificate in Genealogical Research in May of 2020. Since then, she has completed continuing education at the Institute of Genealogy and Historical Research, the Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh, and the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy. She is a graduate of ProGen 58, and she has previously served as the vice chair, chair, and immediate past chair of the National Genealogical Society Delegate Council. Kate holds the Certified Genealogist credential as of February 2024. Although Kate has been working on her own family history since she was 16, her interest in investigating and researching on a professional level was piqued when she served as an archives technician at the National Archives and Records Administration while completing her undergraduate studies. She worked as a resource for amateur and professional genealogical researchers alike, assisting them in conducting database and archives records research. Additionally, she gained experience with primary source documents in her first position with NARA, where she worked in the Holdings Maintenance Department, preserving and cataloging records dating back to the 1800s. Without further ado, let's welcome Kate.
Thank you so much, Sierra, and thank you to the Heinz History Center as a whole for developing, believing in, and sponsoring this lecture series. I'm so excited to be in front of you today as we kick off this lecture series very appropriately with the discussion of tracing your steelworker roots, because we are in the Steel City after all. As a professional genealogist, I work directly with clients of individuals who have Western Pennsylvania roots. And something about us in Western Pennsylvania, and I think all of us sitting in this room today, is we have blue-collar ancestors. This is the type of work that our ancestors typically did. And this is the type of work that I think is overlooked sometimes. It might not be celebrated in the way that it needs to be or understood in the way that it needs to be. And I think tonight we're going to give you some of the records and resources to do that, to learn more about your steelworking ancestors, and to really start a dialogue that I think will continue with the rest of this lecture series on the lives of these individuals who in some respects really helped build America. Now, I do want to draw your attention to the 4 men that are on this starting slide. These are all individuals in my family tree, a direct line, who worked at steel mills in the Pittsburgh area. So the first 2 guys are Joseph Douglas. The guy who's holding the very period-appropriate cigarette is a guy by the name of George Douglas. And the last gentleman is my grandfather, Harold Douglas, who went by the name as Chick because when he started in the steel mill, he had chicken legs, so he was forever known as Chick after that. So keeping in mind ancestors such as these and the ones that you have, let's get started. So what can we identify about our steel-working ancestors? There are 2 types of records, sort of like buckets of records we can identify. The first is almost like the Holy Grail, and that's a record that directly mentions your ancestors. So that could be something like an employment card or a change of rate card. So that's a card that shows when they got like a pay raise or something like that. Really something that has our ancestors' name on it, that is biographical information that directly names them. Now, that isn't always possible with these record collections because the type of records that were kept and that are publicly accessible can really vary from steel mill and company to company. However, even if a record doesn't directly mention your ancestor by name, this is also important. Both of these record types are important because something that doesn't mention your ancestor by name can still pertain to their life. So by looking at photographs or listening to oral histories or delving into the history of the steel company for which they worked, we can have a greater understanding of their life and acknowledge the type of work that they did. So our agenda for today is I'm going to give a brief background on the steel industry in Western Pennsylvania. We're then going to talk about some genealogical resources that you may or may not be familiar with that can help you determine where your steelworker worked and what they did. And now you might think you already know this information, but I encourage you all to go through the process that I'm going to talk about because, number one, your steelworking ancestor might have worked at one plant, or number two, you might find out that you have a steelworker in your family tree and you had no idea about it. Case in point, my grandfather, not the one on the first slide, but my paternal grandfather, I only knew him as a butcher at the Allegheny Market House. Well, it turns out he also worked for Jones & Laughlin Steel before he started his butcher business. So you never know what you're going to find. And then we're going to discuss research and local repositories. Since we're at the Heinz History Center, we're going to be focusing on repositories in Western Pennsylvania, but the same methodology that I'm going to talk about throughout this lecture can be applied to researching steelworkers elsewhere. So say you have a steelworker who worked in Gary, Indiana, I would encourage you to use the same methodology to find records about that individual. So the history of steel in Western Pennsylvania. So steel development began in the mid-19th century, and we were lucky in a way here in Western Pennsylvania because we had two of the natural resources which were at the time very crucial to steel development, iron ore and coal. And we also had coal as natural resources and iron. We had railroads that were built and can continue to be built, and we have the rivers around us. So there was sort of like a interconnection between these industries. They fueled one another. So as the increase of coal happened, that was likely because the steel industry had an increase in the demands for coal and vice versa. So where were the predominant steel towns? Now, of course, Pittsburgh was a steel town, and Homestead, so Pittsburgh adjacent, Braddock, Aliquippa. So in Aliquippa, you have like the Jones & Laughlin steel mill that was there, and we're going to be talking about some of those records later on in the presentation. We also have towns like Monessen, Duquesne, and nearby McKeesport, where there were steel mills, Clareton, and Johnstown. Now, there are more towns that you could add to this list, but these are some of the main ones that I just want to have on your radar for tonight. So who worked in the steel mills? So immigrants, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, worked in the steel mills, particularly when there was a rush of immigration from, say, like the 1880s to the 1920s. There was famine, there were issues in Europe that really were push factors for individuals to come to the United States at that time. And even in Italy, off the coast of Sicily, and I believe it's 1907, there was a giant tsunami that wiped out parts of the town and industry there. So a lot of Italians came after 1907 and might have found themselves working in a steel mill in Western Pennsylvania. We also have African Americans who migrated north, perhaps after Reconstruction, from the South who engaged in steel work. And we also had immigrant laborers that might have come from countries like England, Ireland, and Germany that already had perhaps the iron industry or the steel industry there, so they had a lot of transferable skills that they could bring to their work here in the United States. Now, what were the conditions like in steel mills? I think it goes without saying, particularly in light of the tragic accident yesterday, working in a steel mill can be incredibly dangerous. There were not a lot of regulations about the dangers in the steel mill industry until later in the 20th century. There were a lot of accidents that would occur, and sometimes these accidents could be fatal. And my husband's family, his grandfather worked at Irvin Works, and he would tell us stories about viewing people, passing away in tragic accidents that were quite grisly in the steel mill. And that's, in like the 1960s and 1970s, so it's really not that long ago. Speaking of accidents, my grandfather, so that guy on the far right on the first slide, my mom would say he would come home from work and would sometimes have like burns on his arms, And he would say it was nothing, just some like acid or something got on me in the mill. But like these types of dangerous conditions and small accidents, I think, were quite pervasive in the dangerous nature of this type of work. Additionally, particularly in the era of Andrew Carnegie, the shifts at steel mills were very long. At one point in Andrew Carnegie steel mills, people would work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they would only get 1 day off a year as a holiday, and it wasn't Christmas, it was the 4th of July. So this was very tiring, grueling labor that individuals put in to this work. So how do I research my steelworker ancestor? So the first thing that you need to do is identify where they worked and what they did. So how do you do that? And why do you want to know that? So you want to know where your ancestor worked and what they did because it gives you a jumping off point for your research. So say that you know your ancestor worked at Duquesne Works and that they were a foreman in a particular department. You can then use that information to find applicable collections and local repositories that we're going to get into more detail throughout my presentation and with the lightning talks to find records that would be applicable to their life and work. Now, it's not a foolproof process to identify this information. It's not like we have, some sort of book that you can go to and it says that, John Smith worked at Woodworks doing XYZ position for every year. However, we can have some genealogical tips up our sleeves to help find this information. So this is not an exhaustive list that I'm going to show you, but we're going to be looking at genealogical records that you might be familiar with to give you this information. And the methodology of identifying where your steelworker worked and what they did can be applied anywhere. So I mentioned, at the beginning of the presentation, if you have a steelworker who worked in, say, Gary, Indiana, you can apply this methodology to identify information on them. So the first resource we're going to talk about is U.S. federal census records, which you might be familiar with already. So the U.S. federal census has been taken every 10 years since 1790. The most recent census record collection that is publicly accessible is the 1950 census because they only go public after 72 years. And beginning in 1850, the U.S. federal census gave us information about an individual's occupation. So if you go and identify these records, a good place to do that is on familysearch.org, which is a free website. You just have to create a login, or ancestry.com, which is a paid website. You can search for an ancestor, and you should be able to get some basic occupation information. Now, this record here is from the 1930 U.S. federal census. And we have Joseph W. Douglas, and I want to bring your attention to him. It says his occupation was a heater, and he worked at the Woods Mill. So right off the bat for Joseph W. Douglas, looking at the census, I have an idea of what his occupation was. I don't have a specific department, but I know he worked as a heater at the Woods Mill. Now his son, George Douglas, listed here, was a steel inspector in a steel mill. It doesn't give us the precise steel mill that he worked in, but this family worked in McKeesport, so you could infer that perhaps he worked at Woodworks with his father, or maybe he worked across the river with at Duquesne Works. So sometimes you have to put a little bit of information together about where somebody lived and what mills were close by, but it's definitely something that can be achieved. The next type of record we're going to talk about are city directory records. Now, city directories, I like to think of are like white pages with occupation information. And I hope everyone in this room still knows what white pages are. And these records for the Pittsburgh area are pretty comprehensive, starting in like the late 1840s, where you can go year by year to identify your ancestor, and these city directory records, where it'll give you their name, occupation, and address. These are accessible at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh on microfilm, but I also suggest you go on a free website called historicpittsburgh.org to identify these records, and you can look through them year by year. The reason why this can be really helpful is this is a listing, this is a little bit earlier, this is from 1880. This is a guy called Harry Townsend, and he works as a puddler, and he lives at 75 Belmont, And the A next to Belmont indicates that he lived in Allegheny City, not Pittsburgh. So he lived across the river in what is today Pittsburgh's north side. So I can look at this information. I see he was a puddler. I know puddler is an occupation that would be used in like the iron and steel industry. But I have no idea where he worked exactly. So on this page, I decided to look at an old map. This is GM Hopkins Company map. It's from 2 years later in 1882. These maps are publicly accessible on historicpittsburgh.org. You can also view them in person here. And I use like a Pittsburgh Historic Map tool on that website, arcgis.com, that I would encourage you to Google Pittsburgh Historic Map tool, and it's really incredible. But anyway, what I did here is I identified Belmont Street, which I've highlighted in red. So Harry Townsend lives on Belmont Street in 1880. And I looked around Belmont Street to see what type of businesses there are. And pretty much in his backyard, there's LaBelle Steelworks. Now, I have no direct evidence that says Harry Townsend definitely worked in LaBelle Steelworks. And it's unlikely that I'm going to get that direct evidence, but I can make an inference that that's likely where he worked and sort of go from there. Another great place to get this information is newspaper records. For Western Pennsylvania, I encourage you to look at newspapers.com, particularly if you have Pittsburgh ancestors. It is a paid subscription service. However, their collection of Pittsburgh area newspapers is absolutely fantastic. So if you're researching your still working ancestor and Pittsburgh, that is where I would go. Case in point, that's where I identified this obituary for a guy named Theodore J. Piper. This is from 1966, and it says that he was a retired civil engineer at Duquesne Works, and it also notes in the obituary that he had been employed there for 35 years. So when you're looking at those two things in combination, it seems like that's likely the place where he spent most of his career, and now you know what he did and where he did it. Now, sometimes there were just offhand articles on individuals who worked in steel mills. This is for a guy called Carl Nystrom. He was higher up in the steel industry, and he's my great uncle. He was a general superintendent at the woodworks plant, and he was photographed in the newspaper because he was showcasing an artifact for the plant that had been identified. So sometimes you might see some interaction between the news and what was happening in the steel mill, and you might be able to find your ancestor there to identify where they worked and what they did. So the next thing we're going to talk about is draft registration cards. Men needed to, depending on their age, needed to register for the draft both for World War I and World War II. And these records have occupation information on them, which can be very helpful. Both World War I and World War II draft registration cards are available online for free on FamilySearch.org, and then if you have a paid subscription to Ancestry.com. So we're going to look at this record here for Vince Canis, and it says that he was a laborer at the Carnegie Steel Company in Duquesne, Pennsylvania. So that seems likely he was a laborer at the Duquesne Works mill, if you're researching him. Now on this next card, this is from another year, so the draft registration card looks a little bit different. This is from 1918, and the card on the previous page was from 1917. We have this record for John Emanuel Nystrom, and for his occupation information, he provides a lot of great detail. He says he's a corn maker and a foundry at Tube and Pipe Mill at the National Tube Company in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. So for him, we have great specifics and information about what he did and where he did it. So very similar to those draft registration cards from World War I, we have those World War II draft registration cards. And this one is for George Douglas, who was on that census record that we looked at. And he indicates that he worked for Carnegie, Illinois' Woodworks in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, which was a subsidiary of U.S. Steel at the time. So again, we don't have exactly what he did within the mill, but we do know where he worked, which can be very helpful. Now, the last record we're going to talk about in this regard is marriage records. And I really like this particular marriage record for a reason that I'll get to in a second. But marriage records in Pennsylvania, to give you some background, were not required to be recorded on a consistent basis until September 1885. And sometimes they'll have some great occupational information within them. And there are some collections on Ancestry and Family Search that I don't think are necessarily comprehensive for even Allegheny County. So if you are trying to find a marriage record for your ancestor, sometimes the best bet is just to go to the county courthouse to obtain that record. Now, I already alluded to it, but this is a great marriage record because it's for two individuals, Michael and Mary, who were both steel workers at the Duquesne Works plant, or at least that's my inference because they were steel workers in Duquesne, Pennsylvania. Now, this record is from September 1945, September 12th to be exact, so less than a month after VJ Day. So it's interesting that a woman is working in the steel mill at this time, and I know that we're going to have somebody from Rivers of Steel is going to be discussing some of the records that we have about women working in steel mills that I think will be particularly interesting if you do have a female steel worker in your family tree. Oh, one more thing, naturalization records. So this one here is for Franinus, and I'm not going to say the last name, but this record shows that he was living in Homestead, Pennsylvania, and he worked as a steel worker. Now, naturalization records, and we're going to be talking about immigration on the next slide, is a topic that you can spend like a whole week studying, and they can be difficult to find some of these records depending on the time period. But a lot of the records for Western Pennsylvania are digitized online on both Family Search and Ancestry.com. So after you've gotten through that process of determining where your ancestor worked and what they did, the next thing I think that you should do is determine whether they were an immigrant. So how do you find this out? It's really going through some of the records that we've already talked about where there might be some notations that somebody was an immigrant. So there's US federal census records, World War I and World War II draft registrations, marriage records, an obituary, death certificate, and even birth certificates for children will ask the birthplace of the mother and father in a lot of cases. So to go back to this record from the World War I draft registration for Vince Canis, it shows here, it asks the question whether he was a US citizen, he's not naturalized, and it gives specifics for where he was born in Hungary. So why do you want to know this information? Knowing this information can help you inform your understanding of your ancestor. So you can understand their experience in the mills further. So for example, you might be able to imagine that you have an ancestor coming from a country where, English isn't the native language. They're in the United States, working in dangerous conditions, and they don't understand the language around them, and how that would be terrifying in a way, but also took an enormous amount of bravery and courage. It also can point you in the direction of other records that you can procure for them. So this could be something like a passenger list record, a declaration of intention for naturalization. We saw an example of a petition for naturalization, and something called the USCIS genealogy program records, as well as records that have been accessioned to the National Archives and Records Administration from USCIS. Now again, this is a complicated topic. I could talk about this for a week with you. But it's the type of thing that if you do have 20th century immigrant ancestors, I like to bring up to people so it's at least on their radar so they can go and explore these records further. Additionally, in your handout, I have some suggestions for some material to help give you more of a basis on these type of records. So your third step is going to be to research the occupation, place of work, and the steel company for your ancestor. So why do you want to do this? So knowing where your steelworker, what your steelworker did and where they worked helps to inform your understanding of what regional archives you should contact to get more information about them. Because you can research the steel mill itself, you can research anything from the working conditions. We're going to talk about like grievance reports within a steel mill, so like the complaints that employees had about their conditions. It can also help you understand what an individual's job entailed, so you could get specifics about what the duties were for a particular job description at a particular time. You can also research the company to understand big events. So I think an obvious one would be, say you realize that your ancestor worked at the Homestead Works during the time of the Homestead strike. Well, then you can go on further and research that event and how it might have affected their working life. And doing all of this provides color and understanding to your ancestor's life so you understand their work in the steel mill better. Now we're going to talk about those records that might directly name your ancestor, which I think are the types of records that everybody wants to be able to find in an archive because it's so exciting to do that. And we're going to showcase some of the opportunities to do so. So I do want to preface this discussion with some news that's a little bit unfortunate. The first thing is records are not available for all steel mills, particularly for mills that are still in operation. Those records have not been accessioned to, say, like the Heinz History Center. Additionally, not records are comprehensive for all employees. So just because you find a record collection of employees at, say, Duquesne Works, that doesn't mean it's going to be comprehensive for all workers for all time periods. So, for example, you're likely not going to get a record that directly names your ancestor until the 20th century because the records were just not maintained or they haven't survived, until we get into the 20th century. And another thing is not all records cover all locations or departments. So when you go through this, the archival research process, and I think our lightning talk speakers will be able to speak about this more, you really have to keep that in mind, that there are some things you might be able to find, but it's also possible that there's not going to be something that's going to directly link you to your ancestor. Now, I know Zach will be speaking about this a little bit further, about how some of these record collections were identified, and it was, at some points, my understanding is the plant closed and individuals were, told to come in and gather up the records, and what was left is what is now in these archival collections today. Now, the good news is there are some incredible records. Case in point, the Jones and Laughlin employee cards. These employee cards have been digitized and are available on Ancestry.com. You can also view them in person here at the Heinz History Center. There is a year restriction on these employee cards, meaning you can only access them if the card is 70 years or older. And these cards are just for the Pittsburgh plant, primarily the Pittsburgh Works. And if you had somebody who worked for Jones and Laughlin Steel, say as a clerk in an office, we really haven't, through my work with this, identified that you're going to find an employee card for that individual. It's mainly for the workers in the mill. Now, let's look at an example of one of these. Now, they vary a little bit from year to year, but there's some great biographical information on these cards that can point you into the direction of other records and also understanding the life of an ancestor in further detail. So this first record here is for this guy, Camino Pazzi, and right off the bat, it's going to say that he is from Italy. It's going to give his age as 31. He's an Italian national, which is quite confusing because then it says he's a citizen and he was naturalized in 1920, and that he came to the United States in 1907. So if I see that information, I can infer, if I want to find, say, a passenger list record for him, so a record of his arrival in the United States, we have some information that says that he came in 1907. We also have some information that he became a U.S. citizen in 1920. We also have a description of him that's a physical description that includes his height, his weight, how tall, how full his face is, and the color of his hair, which I think is quite interesting because sometimes we don't have photographs of our ancestors, but we might get a physical description such as this, which can help us imagine what they might have looked like. It also has some information about who to contact in case of emergency, which is his wife, Mary Camino, so now we have her name. And in this column, it talks about education. It says that he can read and write. His native language is Italian, but he only went to school until the 6th grade. So that's just interesting information about, his upbringing, and his education that you might want to know about your ancestor. And the last thing is we have like some social status information on this right side, including the fact that he has 3 children, age 9, 6, and he has a 2-week-old daughter, Marie. So he's starting work in the steel mills when he has a new baby at home. And we also have information that his religion is RC, or Roman Catholic, which is quite common with Italian-American ancestors. But that can also point us in the direction of identifying Diocese of Pittsburgh records, because this guy did live in Pittsburgh, which are quite robust and what has been kept. So on the back side of this card, you'll see that he was only a laborer for a couple of days, I believe. He started on September 7th, 1935, and he ended his employment for failure to report on September 11th, 1935. And the interesting thing with this record collection is that we've noticed a lot of people only worked at Jones and Laughlin Steel for a short period of time. So since this stuff is like digitized on Ancestry, if you do have a subscription, or if you even want to go to your local library, I would just search for your steelworking ancestor in this database, because you never know, they could have worked for Jones and Laughlin Steel for 4 days like this guy, but through that 4-day stint, we have a tremendous amount of information on this card. So now we're going to look at this guy, Michaelis. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. And he is somebody that we'll see worked for J&L Steel for a long time. Now, he came in as a stove cleaner, so we have his exact job description there. And we also have information here. This is from a card that's a little bit different than the one we saw on the prior page. We have his native language, that his family is in the old country. We have that physical description here. We also know that he's been in the United States for 4 years, and that he has filed his first papers, which means his declaration of intention for naturalization. So the first step at the time in the immigration process in most cases, and he filed those in 1932. So we have a lot of good information there about him that we can use to find other information. So for the 4 years, you could go back 4 years from when this record was created to try to identify a record of him arriving in the United States, for example. Now, a lot of times on these cards, they ask about former employers, so that's also really handy information to have in your back pocket to identify where else your ancestor worked. So for this guy, he was a laborer at Spring Company, and he left because he was laid off. Now, on the back of his record, it notes that he had a double inguinal hernia, and it was declared that it was okay for him to work in the mill as long as he wore a belt, which I think is fascinating that some medical information is actually on this record. And we also have his dates of employment, and I believe he served for a total of 19 years with J&L Steel until like 2 days before he passed away. So sometimes we get gentlemen and ladies who worked here for a long time. Now, this last record from this collection, I would say that I have a personal connection to. This is the grandfather of my mother's best friend, who is an Italian immigrant. She immigrated here in the 1960s. I told her I was doing this presentation, and she just offhandedly said, you know, my grandfather came to the United States for a time, and then he moved back to Italy, and he saved a lot of money when he did that, and that's why in Italy, you know, we had a house there, and we had a little bit of extra money. So this guy, Carmine Bucci, was a bird of a passage, is what it's called, someone who comes to the United States and works, and then goes back to their native country. So he lived on Bouquet Street in Oakland, which I think is interesting because the Italian-American community that my mother's best friend grew up in was also in Oakland. But it has some details about, you know, who to contact in case of emergency, and he says his wife, who is in Gambarel, Italy. So I think it's important to recognize that some people would work in this industry and then go back to their native country. So sometimes you can be looking at those records too. Now we're going to talk about an additional Jones and Laughlin employee cards collection at the University of Pittsburgh Archives and Records Center. I've talked to Zach and Sierra about this collection in detail. We're not quite sure why there are two sets of cards. Now, these cards are in person to view them, and they do have a difference up at the top. It says Jones and Laughlin Steel General Superintendent Collection. But this record is for William Townsend, and it gives some basic information about him, not as much as those other cards that we looked at, like that he was a laborer and that he worked on that he lived on Reed Street. And we also have information about his age, his marital status, and that he understood the English language. So definitely check these cards out if you do have a J&L ancestor, because I have found that I believe that you could have a card that's at the University of Pittsburgh and one in that Ancestry section for Pittsburgh J&L employees. Now we're going to talk about employee cards for Aliquippa workers that are at the Beaver County Industrial Museum. Now, the Beaver County Industrial Museum has a lot more records related to J&L and Aliquippa aside from just an employment card such as this. This one's for a female steelworker named Catherine Ferry. It shows that she worked in a tin mill as an assorter, and that she was actually a rehire, and that she had formerly worked in the tin mill. So it documents some changes in her career there. And I do believe that there's about 40,000 of these cards that have been digitized by the Beaver County Industrial Museum, which is absolutely incredible. So for your J&L Steel ancestors who worked in Aliquippa, definitely go and make a visit there and check out their collections. So now we're going to talk about some Duquesne Works employee cards, and these are at the University of Pittsburgh Archives and Special Collections. This one here is for a guy, Jack P. Douglas. It gives his date of birth at the top of the record, and then underneath here we have sort of like a history of his positions within the steel mill and what he did within the steel mill. Now, these records I'm not sure if you can tell, from this photograph, they're often like little files. So this is what the file looks like when it's opened up. And I want to highlight his termination notice, which just means that when he quit working the steel mill, he did so due to ill health. So that's just some interesting information you might be able to directly find about your ancestor. So the next thing we're going to talk about is national defense cards. These are also at the University of Pittsburgh Archives and Record Center. Now, during the 1940s, steelworkers would have to go through an investigation when they were working on national defense projects. And they would have records such as this one recorded for them with copies of their fingerprints and, a lovely original signature of the steelworker. And on the back of this record, we have some information that this guy here was a blacksmith helper at the National Tube Company. And we also have information that he was a citizen, where he got his citizenship, what date, and there's a number above the word citizenship there that's likely something called a C number, and I was talking about additional immigrant records that you could identify. There's a corresponding file that you can order from the USCIS Genealogy Service called a C file using those numbers. So again, there's a lot of clues genealogically wise on these records. And of course, for this guy, Nick DiNardo, we do have the photo of him. It's a little grainy, but it is cool to find a photo of your ancestor in an archive. So the next record we're going to talk about is Duquesne Works employee rate change cards. So these are cards when individuals change of rate, so how much they were paid was adjusted. This record is for Frank Drago. It has his address, something called a check number, which in some cases I have found is the same as an employee number, date of birth, what he did, the rate of pay. And then it also shows what his rate of pay previously was and why it changed, and it was because he was applying to be a labor foreman. We're now going to talk about employee photographs. Now, to identify employee photographs, this is where if you're looking in a repository and you want an employee photographed that will likely name your ancestor by name, you have to do a little bit of digging. These are from a collection at the University of Pittsburgh Archives and Record Center, And in this collection, they just had photographs, I believe, of like bigwigs within the steel industry. And I believe this is from Duquesne Works, where you have like these formal, almost like headshots of individuals that are labeled by name that you can go through and peruse. The next thing we're going to talk about is coroner's records. So we've talked a lot about how steel work was dangerous work, especially in light of the fatal accident yesterday in Clairton. And it's always been dangerous work to go about. So there are coroner's records that are available at the University of Pittsburgh Archives and Special Collections from 1884 to 1976 for Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. In some of the surrounding counties, there are also coroner's records, but they're not centralized at Pitt like they are for Allegheny County. The way that you identify that someone might have been involved in a coroner's record, from my typical experience for steelworkers specifically, is it might be on a death certificate, it might be in family lore. We also have some resources at some of the local repositories where there are death registers for various mills, but it's not comprehensive. In any case, if you do identify that a steelworking ancestor might have died as a result of their work, there are these coroner's files, and they can look like this. They usually have quite a few pages to them that'll give some biographical information about the deceased. It'll also outline what happened to cause the death, witnesses to the death, and really, give you some information about what happened. So these can be hard to look at. They can be grisly in a way. It can be upsetting to read a coroner's record, but if it's something that you want to pursue and almost acknowledge the sacrifice that somebody had working in these positions, it's definitely something to explore. So now we're going to talk about those records that might indirectly involve your ancestor. So I know we focused on, some of the mills within the greater Western Pennsylvania region. And the reason we did that is because these are the records, the mills that have some of like the best records. And I'm hoping that the lightning talks will give you some further information in combination with the handouts for those lightning talks. But there might be some records that might not involve your ancestor directly, but will still shed light about their work as a steelworker. So the first thing is photographs. Now, Historic Pittsburgh has, a great collection of photographs, that free website that you can go to. There's also photographs like the ones I mentioned that you can look at the various local repositories. But the photographs that we're going to look at now are from the Library of Congress's photo collection, and there's some really good ones there. There's this first one of a steelworker from 1938. And he has his goggles on his hat, and we actually have an example from Rivers of Steel of goggles that are very similar to the ones that this gentleman is wearing. We also have this photo of a steelworker working in a galvanizing machine, so you can see what that work was like. And you can also see that he's not really wearing a lot of protective gear for doing what I would think is a very dangerous job. And then this is also a photo of a street in the Mill District of Pittsburgh by Jack Delano. I think this shows just how impressive and large the steel mills were and just how steep the walk was to the homes where the workers worked with like the mill sort of ominously below. And I know this photo is black and white, but I swear I can just see the pollution in the photograph. And this photo is undated. It's from the Duquesne Works, but you might be able to see there's a worker. I don't think you can see my cursor, but there's a worker sort of like down a little bit up from the left corner, and you can see the scale of the machinery and that like there's like molten product within the machinery, just like, and how sort of crazy it would be to work with that on a day in and day out basis. So we've talked a lot, in the genealogical section about the importance of identifying what your steelworker did, and that's because you might be able to find employee job descriptions within these archival records. So this is an example from the conditioning department at Duquesne Works, where it gives specifics about what a foreman was to do in that department. So even if your ancestor wasn't a foreman in that department, but they worked in the conditioning department, looking through a list such as this can help inform you about the type of work that your ancestor engaged in. We talked about on a prior slide about Harry Townsend, who worked as a puddler. This is from a book from 1922 about puddlers, where it gives a description about how puddlers would have to work with like hot iron, and they would boil the impurities out of it that would be used in steel making. There's also some examples of employee payments that you can find in these archival collections. Again, this is from Duquesne Works, and this is from 1898, I believe, 1899. And it's a list of what individuals were paid in the furnace department at Duquesne Works. So if you know your ancestor worked there, even if it wasn't in the furnace department, by looking at this, you might be able to identify what their wage might have been approximately around at the time and extrapolate that into today's money. I think that this can be really helpful, especially for those of us who have individuals who worked in the steel industry, say prior to 1900, when there's not a lot of tangible records that would directly name your ancestor. Now, a lot of these steel companies maintained employee newsletters, which can be really helpful to identify what was happening at the steel mill. And occasionally there's even like birth announcements of children you might see in these newsletters and other information to provide color about your ancestor's life. But on like an occasion, you might be able to find something that directly names them. So we're going to look at two examples. These are both from Levinson Steel. So this is from December 1965. It just gives a president's message about what was happening in the steel mill at the time. But the newsletter from the following year has these great photographs that include workers in them with names underneath that you could peruse to try to identify the name of your ancestor and a corresponding photograph. A lot of times people have a lot of questions about the pensions that their steelworking ancestors received, and sometimes this information was documented in archival collections. Case in point, the U.S. Steel Agreement with the United Steelworkers of America from April 1962 for the pension is available to read in its entirety if you so choose at the Archives and Special Collections at the University of Pittsburgh. So you can dig into some of these details to get that information. One thing that I think is particularly helpful are oral histories, because sometimes in these records we don't get exactly the stories of the workers themselves. And with these oral histories, that's a means to do so, where workers are giving their story of what it was like to work in a steel mill. So one great example of this is the Recordings of Southern Blacks Migration to Pittsburgh Oral History Project. This was taken in the 1970s, and this particular interview was of a gentleman that worked in Homestead who talks about the safety hazards and the experience of working there. So if you have African American steelworking ancestors, this is a great resource for you, but even if you don't, this is a great resource to understand what it was like working at that steel mill at the time. The next thing is union records. Now, union records are kept primarily at the University of Pittsburgh and at Penn State, and they're not necessarily what you would hope. It's not like we have like a register with a bunch of union membership cards that you can explore, but there are records that can be at your disposal. So at Penn State, they have a historical collection and labor archives there, and they have United Steelworker records, which includes executive board records. So within those records, you might be able to identify what was happening with the United Steelworkers at a particular point of time and how that might have affected your ancestor. The one thing I want to point you in the direction of is they do have an incredible oral history project of those workers that, to give a listen to some of those stories, I think can be particularly illuminating. And then here in Pittsburgh at the University of Pittsburgh Archives and Service Center and Special Collections, we have some local records, including for mills in Homestead and McKee's Rocks, that you can explore in person. So there's definitely endless material about the steel industry in Pittsburgh, and I feel like I've just covered the surface of the type of material that you can identify, especially because this is only a 50-minute lecture, and there's so much to engage in. And one thing I do want to note is it's always fun to identify those records that mention your ancestor by name. But if that is not possible for your steelworking ancestor, that does not mean that you shouldn't go to a local archive and repository and really engage, interact, and learn from these records. And thank you so much.
Gosh, thank you so much, Kate, for building that really strong genealogical foundation for us. We're so appreciative. So just a reminder that we're going to be holding questions until the end of all of our lightning talks coming up next. Please do keep those questions rolling in. There are some great ones that have already come our way. So I have the honor of kicking off our lightning talks that will round out our evening's lectures. Just a reminder that 3 local archivists will be talking about records relating to the steel industry that they work with regularly. So I will begin by talking about what is available here at the Heinz History Center. So where I'm headed during my lecture, first and foremost, we need to have a common understanding of who we are at the History Center and how that is relevant to preserving the region's steel heritage and history. Then we're going to dive right in and talk about record sets according to the different companies and plants throughout this region for which we do have original records. Then we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about other can't-miss sources that exist in our collections. We're going to be highlighting both materials that are available online and then those that are not available online but are certainly open for research here at the History Center. And then we'll round things out by talking through some research strategies. So first and foremost, at the History Center, we are all about Western Pennsylvania history. That is the common denominator that exists across all of the materials in our collections, whether we're talking about books or historic newspapers or maps, or original record sets, historic photographs. From our earliest days, we have been dedicated to preserving Western Pennsylvania history. Now, when you look at our collection focuses that I have highlighted on this slide, a number of them just naturally have points of intersection with this region's steel industry. Of course, something as obvious as business and industry has been a strength of ours since fairly early in our history, but also zooming in and looking at and highlighting the stories of individual neighborhoods and communities, as well as families and organizations and places of worship. So again, it runs the gambit, but there are many points of intersection between our collecting strengths and this region's steel industry and heritage. So I want to also then, before we delve into some specific exciting examples, echo Kate's remarks about some of the caveats and opportunities that exist when you look at these incredibly unique and distinct collections of records. So number one, you can see actually in Kate's remarks and highlights of the J&L Steel Soho Works records, the records themselves vary over time. These forms were tweaked over time, and then the type of information that was solicited from employees changed as well. And each individual record set, just like each individual plant, is unique. There are common data points or pieces of information that are often asked of employees, but it's not all uniform. And again, echoing Kate's remarks, record sets are not commonly comprehensive or complete. But and this is where the but comes in from the archivists, records will surprise you with the insights and the questions that they spark. So I really encourage you to give the records room to convey their strengths to you. And we're going to talk about strategies. Before I continue, I just do want to say a moment, acknowledge my colleagues, all of whom have done incredible behind-the-scenes works with these collections to surface them and make them searchable in a way that I can highlight in a snappy, light lightning talk, but I did not want to give any of you the impression that I did all of this work myself. I'm really standing on the shoulders of my colleagues. So let's kick things off again by revisiting a set of records that Kate just highlighted, the J&L Steel Soho Works records that are available for keyword searching on Ancestry.com. I want to put some hard dates around these records. So the earliest record that exists in the collection is 1890, and it runs to 1973. Again, all of these have been digitized. There are over 100,000 of them. However, to protect the privacy of those individuals who may still be alive, all the records that date after 1955 are temporarily restricted. And once we hit that 70-year mark year over year, Ancestry will then open up those records as well as the associated metadata and information about these files so that the materials that are created in 1955 will be searchable as of 2026. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, excellent. And then Kate already talked about my other main conversation point for these records. So again, this is J&L Steel Soho Works. The other item that I wanted to highlight is the fact that early on, it's uncommon, but not impossible, that there actually is an image of your ancestor associated with the card that looks troublingly like a mugshot, and perhaps they did feel like they were going to be incarcerated every day in their work. But there are some remarkable images, and the images become much more common as the records date later and later. Okay, U.S. Steel Duquesne Works. We actually have many pockets of employee files, again, some of which Kate has already highlighted, that name individual workers at Duquesne over time. So I'm going to go through these record sets in chronological order. All of these have not been digitized, but as you'll see, they're fairly early to search, or easy to search. The earliest we have are a run of records that document people who didn't pick up their paychecks. These run from 1895 to 1907. They are in chronological order, so it would take you kind of thumbing through the names year after year. But again, if you know when your ancestor worked for the company, then you can home in on which records within this set are relevant for you. These is an example of some of the earliest individually identifiable records of workers at any steel mill that we have in our collection. I'm highlighting one particular entry here for Mr. Shannon. So you can see there's a lot going on in the remarks field, so that drew my attention. And when you look closely, you see that Mr. Shannon didn't pick up his paycheck, and in the margin it's written, he left his family, and that the paycheck thankfully did get to Mrs. Shannon, who actually approached the company having his check or some form of identification in mind, and that further, her son, who also worked at Duquesne Works, positively identified her as his mother, and the money was paid out to her in 1900. Next up are surgeons' reports. So these fill just one box in the Duquesne Works collection. They run from 1910 to 1914. They are in chronological order, so again, it would be a matter of thumbing through if you had ancestors at Duquesne Works during this time period. But there are some interesting insights into these individual employees that had to seek some medical help at the time. So in the married or single box, you could see the word yes for this individual worker. But oftentimes, actually, the wife's name is written out, which is really lovely. And then next to it is the number of children. So similar to the J&L Soho Works, this gentleman had 4 children. Their names aren't listed, but their ages at the time are, which is really great. And then some additional information about their previous positions held. We also have these have a kind of a commonality or echo the coroner's records. These are workmen's compensation records. As you might imagine, there's a lot of information not only about the individual steelworker and what particular injury they met, but also, of course, names of dependents who may have been beneficiaries, particularly in instances of fatalities. So I came across this example of a Lee Wallace who was injured in 1952. So he's actually quite old at the time as a steelworker. He's 61. And some of his beneficiaries, one of them has a birth date of 1865. I just think like that is remarkable, truly remarkable. So there are possibilities to get insights into family trees. In this instance, we have a stepmother and a stepsister that's listed, and their dates of birth also teased out as well. Kate highlighted these change of rate cards that we have at Duquesne Works. They run from the 1930s to the 1940s. They are in alphabetical order and fill 2 boxes. So again, we're not talking about hundreds of boxes, but if you have ancestors that worked at Duquesne Works during this time period, it might be worth a flip through. In this particular instance, there's additional annotation on the back. So there's a pretty good record of when this gentleman worked at Duquesne Works. So there's specific dates listed, and then there's an annotation saying that, like, for pretty much a year, there was no trace of him. And then he came back, and he's been with us ever since. And then he, has received a change of rate, so he's doing something right. Within the Duquesne Works collections, there's a lot that covers the period of World War II. So again, if you have an ancestor who worked for U.S. Steel Duquesne Works during World War II, it behooves you to take a step back and think about records that are more broadly relevant to your ancestor, rather than just records that identify them by name. So there's a great comprehensive run of individual job descriptions. So even if you have ancestors who are working in the steel industry generally, maybe a U.S. Steel plant, 30s, 40s, 50s, it might be worthwhile to check out these job descriptions to find company-specific information about what your ancestor was doing. There's also great insight into the managerial machinations building up to VE Day and the frenzy around whether or not they're going to have workers leave their positions because everybody's so relieved and excited that the war is hopefully approaching a close. There's also a lot about women workers. So if you had women working on the home front during World War II in the steel mills, definitely worthwhile to check this collection out. There's also really great illustrations that help break down and build out the process of steel production, in particular at U.S. steel plants, but also just more broadly. Now, hopping over to Homestead Works, we have fewer individual employee records, but we do have these employee information cards that run from the 1940s to the 1960s. Again, alphabetical order, fairly easy to make your way through. In this instance, we have a women war worker, Lena Campbell, and we see that she joins the company in 1944, but in 1946, she's laid off and replaced by a veteran, which is a really interesting insight. And we think about other genealogical records that are possible for somebody like Lena, getting insight into the fact that she didn't leave the company, voluntarily might really help us piece together more of her story. Also, I just can't get away from these women steelworkers. I think they're so fascinating. There's a run of employee union arbitration records for a variety of companies and unions that are in this collection of Homestead Works records. So we certainly have a run of these arbitration decisions for United Steelworkers that go from 45 to 77. Something to keep in mind is that the employees are not always identified, but it helps get us closer to the employee perspective, whether in aggregate or individually. The example that I have on this slide is from the American Steel and Wire, between the American Steel and Wire Company and United Steelworkers. It's an example of a woman who is, the title is Equal Pay for Women Doing Men's Work. So in the fall of 1945, we have Cecilia Sawalski, who's had enough. She goes and wants representation from her union to say that she's consistently been doing a job that had formerly been done by a man, and she knows for a fact that the man was paid more. And I'm very happy to say that she won. So yeah, that's right. So imagine if this is your individual ancestor getting these incredible insights into her advocacy and her career. There are other union arbitration records that are represented within this aggregate as well. And here is just a much richer background on Ms. Sawalski and again the circumstances that brought her before her union and before the arbitration authority. We also have documentation, including original notices that were posted by, at the time, Carnegie Steel Company, U.S. Steel, during the greater context of the Homestead Strike of 1892. On the far right, there's also a really interesting notice that the company is making, in particular to, I believe, Lithuanian and other Slavic workers who there was some confusion purportedly around whether or not there was a comfort level in rejoining the ranks after the conclusion of the strike. So again, this is another example of records that really reflect the perspectives of these companies. In this case, this is from the Carnegie Steel Company records. We do have other materials documenting the Homestead Strike, but I'm going to defer a lot of space to my other lightning talk speakers for additional materials relating to the strike and the employee's vantage point. We also have other steel companies. These are much smaller collections, but they're not your J&L and your U.S. Steel that I wanted to highlight. We have materials, original records relating to Levinson Steel that operated out of the South Side at its peak, having 3,000 employees. We also have some records relating to Copperweld Steel Company that operated out of Rankin and Glassport, as well as Macintosh Hemphill Company that operated out of the South Side. And then we also had a question come in about the Heppenstall Steel Company, and I was able to check before my formal remarks, and we do have a box of records relating to the Heppenstall Steel Company that I missed. So we'll talk about that further during the Q&A. Other can't-miss sources. So again, I want to echo Kate in emphasizing oral histories for their real potential in being able to center the actual voices of steelworkers. So we also have a collection documenting the perspectives of African-American steelworkers. This oral history project was also done in the 1970s by Dennis Dickerson, who's the author of Out of the Crucible. There are 22 oral histories, and the topics touched upon include migration patterns and push and pull factors that brought these folks to the region to work in steel. Certainly social organizations and churches that helped shape the community for these individual steelworkers, as well as the discrimination that they face, and then also how they face the decline of the industry. We also have an incredible array of historic photographs that can be used to really help bring to life the individual humanity involved in the steel industry. We certainly have early illustrations, so drawn illustrations, as well as photographs that relate to specific companies. The best way to look through these collections of photographs is to start by searching by the company name, and also look within the time period that your ancestor worked for a particular company. We also just broadly have photographic documentation of the steel towns over time, the decline of the industry, and some photographic documentation of strikes. Fraternal organizations. So we have a number of collections that document other affiliations that that your ancestors may have had outside of their employment within the steel industry. So one example that I wanted to highlight today are the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, that is a Catholic Irish beneficial organization. We have their Homestead chapter records. Here's an example of a membership application of a steelworker from Homestead that highlights the organization asked about his immigration status. So there are really helpful insights that you can get from these types of records. And the way that you approach searching for these, we don't expect you to know about the AOH, if you don't know that facet of your family's history, is to really start by searching by town and then ethnic group, and you might be able to come across aggregates of records like this. We also have wonderful collections of published materials in our library holdings relating to these individual companies, individual unions, as well as these steel towns. I have a wide array of different types of books. And of course, we have a selection that you can actually thumb through yourself this evening at our table. Gosh, I could spend so much time talking about the opportunities that exist within within the library collection. But what I will say is, again, it's another space to kind of take a step outside of the company's perspective and to hopefully look for those memoirs, those yearbooks, and also other organizational or faith-based histories that can get you a little closer to your ancestors' perspective. Excuse me. Kate talked about maps and did a wonderful job doing that. The only point that I want to emphasize is that we have a fabulous historic map collection here at the History Center, and many of those maps are not digitized and available online. So again, we'll talk through research strategies, but please do make use of our online catalog. The link is in your handout, and think about approaching by searching for those names of those steel towns and looking for maps around the time period that your ancestor lived in that area. We also have a great internal maps database that can help us as staff internally pull additional maps that might be relevant for you. Oh, employee newsletters. I could talk forever about the possibilities that exist within these newsletters. They are not digitized, so there are some obstacles to really making the most of them, but gosh, do they have the potential to provide incredible insights into your ancestors. Some of them do have indices, but I will say that those indices sometimes are pretty limited or based more on topic of articles rather than indexing individual names. As you can see, we have a number of companies and date ranges represented. All of this information is in your handout. Here's just one example. So on like 2 pages within the U.S. Steel News from 1937, we have great articles about 2 men who retired from different individual plants affiliated with U.S. Steel at the time. We have someone who retired from the Vandergrift Works of U.S. Steel, and he spends time making violins now that he's retired. And there's this great anecdote about the fact that he's made 2 violins that the tops of them were cut from timbers that were once supported at one of the old mills. That was the predecessor of the Vandergrift Works where he spent his career. I mean, it's just like, how could you could never imagine getting an insight like that into an individual ancestor. But it's clear that the folks that wrote these articles were looking for content relating to these individual workers. And then you have a more classic genealogical insight with Ludwig Kruschauer, who is retiring after 50 years of working at the National Tube Company McKeesport Works. And we have great genealogical insights about him being born in Germany in the 1870s, coming to the U.S. in 1882, and then confirming that he became a naturalized citizen. So for your research strategy for this, start with the index if it's available, but know that those indices were not created for genealogists mostly. Identify the key dates. So do you happen to know information about when your ancestor was promoted, when they got married, when they had children, if they were interested in various athletic pursuits, would they have been bowlers for the company bowling team, etc.? When did they retire? Some information like this you can get from the obituaries. And also embrace browsing. These are really fun to flip through. And again, you can do so anytime that we're open at the History Center for research. So, for research strategies, we recommend really doing what you can to narrow your search parameters. So rather than approaching these in many instances, colossal collections relating to these colossal companies, get a sense of, again, based on Kate's incredible guide, narrow by the location that your ancestor lived and the company. Keep in mind current and former names of these individual corporations and search by both the contemporary name and the historic name. Also, if you can get more specific to plant, the better. And then also date range. It can be tough, but again, using resources like city directories and obituaries, get as specific as you can as to when your ancestor worked for individual companies. And then take all of that information to the History Center's online catalog the catalogs of my colleagues who will be presenting next, and leave space for the records to tell you their strengths. I also always like to share my research slot machine with folks, whether it's scholarly or genealogical audiences. Rather than just going to Google and searching for Allegheny Ludlam steel, I recommend interchanging different search terms and phrases that archivists and librarians use when they describe record sets and primary sources, and just mix and match. And you may be able to find references to different collections of records relating to these different companies. And again, this is in your handout as well. And then this is information about how to visit us at the History Center. We are open as a library and archives on the 6th floor, so one floor above us from Wednesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We are always free. You're welcome to drop in, but it's lovely when you give us a heads up and fill out our online appointment form so that we can do some mining and collections and pull additional materials that might be relevant for you. And here's our contact information. Thank you. Here I was letting myself off the hook. I need to introduce our next speaker. I'm honored to welcome our next Lightning Talk speaker, Dr. Kirsten Payne. Dr. Payne is Museum Education and Historic Interpretation Manager at Rivers of Steel. In addition to public history work related to 19th century industrial labor, she specializes in 19th century American women writers. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Pittsburgh in 2019, where she wrote her dissertation, Not According to the Regulation of War. Intimate Civil War writing by female nurses, soldiers, and spies. She is currently revising it into a book. Without further ado, welcome Kirsten.
Okay, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Rivers of Steel because who we are as an organization, I think, might actually go a long way in providing you with some of the harder to come by material culture and experiences that you might be looking for when it comes to putting records together and understanding not just what those records mean, but what was the environment like and what were your ancestors' lives like. And Rivers of Steel can help you with that. So as an organization, Rivers of Steel is a national heritage area. So a national heritage area is, I like to say that we are the second cousin twice removed of the National Park Service. A national heritage area is identified through an act of Congress. And in our case, Rivers of Steel was identified and designated in 1996, which makes us one of the oldest national heritage areas in the United States. And what it does is a national heritage area identifies an area in the United States with specific cultural and historic significance. That it's not necessarily related to geography. It is not necessarily related to a specific monument per se, although I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But what it does is it identifies southwestern Pennsylvania, particularly the 8 counties sort of in our southwestern corner, and puts a stamp on it and says, these counties are specifically important for the preservation and stabilization and stewardship of industrial history, specifically industrial history related to coal, iron, and steel production in the United States. Now, within that, Rivers of Steel acts as a heritage corporation, so we are a 501c3. As a nonprofit, Rivers of Steel stewards, manages, preserves, and essentially maintains for the public, in the public trust, all of those items in the heritage area which have been designated as having particular national historic significance, the chief of which are our physical locations. So as you are doing that genealogical work, and you are going through those cards, or you are looking at letters or other kinds of documents that might identify your ancestor as a puddler, as a boilermaker, as a furnace keeper, as a helper, as a laborer, as a foreman. We actually have physical locations that you can visit to actually see what that work would have been like. And so the chief of which is the Cary blast furnaces over in Rankin. Has anybody ever been to Cary before? Oh, yay! For those of you online, so many hands just went up right now. So I don't really have to explain to you just how overwhelming that place is. When you walk into it and you see these pair of blast furnaces that are, as we know, these are the oldest remaining blast furnaces in the United States, and they are certainly the only remaining examples of pre-World War II iron-making technology left. So come for a visit. Actually come and take a tour of the Cary blast furnaces. That way you can actually walk around with a guide and learn about what was the work like. What was somebody's day-to-day like? What were they being paid? What were they doing? What were the dangers of that job? And that's something that when I have the ability to take people around Cary myself, that's actually something that I like to emphasize, is that these places are extraordinarily dangerous. And yet people came here to do this work anyway. Around the corner, if you're not looking, you could get hit by something, you could get burned by something, you could get run over by a train, you could fall off a platform, you could fall down a set of stairs, something could drop on you. And yet people would do this work anyway for 12 hours a day, for 7 days a week, for $1.65 a day. The average salary or wage of somebody working in these environments was 13 cents an hour. If you're white. If you're not, it's half that. So come to Cary. Take a walk around. Get into the environment. Get up close and personal with a blast furnace. Get up close to the stoves. Go out into the ore yard. Look at the cranes. Go into our powerhouse, where you could see where all of the power in the 1920s for not only Cary, but all of Homestead was generated. Take a look at some of our preservation projects and just get up close to it and see its size, see its scale, and think about your ancestor and that employee record and that card or that union card and think about, okay, this is what they're doing with it, and this is why they're doing it. So that's probably our largest archival holding, really, are the Cary blast furnaces. But hey, honestly, you can see pieces of the steel industry all over Pittsburgh. In fact, and I was just thinking about this because as I was coming in, I drove past it. Around the corner, there is a ladle, which is pictured here off on this slide. This one is a much more modern one, but there is a ladle right around the corner from the 1920s. And what that ladle would do would take molten iron, and it would dump it into a Bessemer converter, which would then turn that iron into steel. Stand right up next to it and see, even if you're a tall person, even if you're somebody who is over 6 feet tall, look at how small you are in comparison to that. So in your research, in the work that you are doing to try to reconstruct the lives of your ancestors, go to the physical sites, get into those environments, look at the scale, look at the scope, and really think about that environment and think about what their day-to-day would have been like. And that is primarily what Rivers of Steel can help you with. In addition to the Cary blast furnaces, we also have the pump house. And the pump house is the site of the Battle of Homestead in 1892. So if you have done your research at Pitt or at Hines, or even with us at Rivers of Steel, and you have learned about the Battle of Homestead and you would like to actually visit the site of that battle, you can go there and look at it. You can go to the pump house, you can walk around inside of it, you can walk around outside of it, you can see its proximity to the river, you can see how close it is to train tracks, and you can really immerse yourself in that environment. The third place you can go in Homestead is just about a 5-minute drive from there, and that is the Boast Building. The Boast Building is downtown Homestead. It's 623 East 8th Avenue. That is mainly our museum, and that is where you will find the rest of our archives. But the Boast Building is also a National Historic Landmark. Pertaining to the Homestead strike, the Battle of Homestead, the Boast Building is where the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steelworkers met to plan their course of action. And the Boast Building is also where the reporters from downtown, once they got on that train and they went up to Homestead to see what was going on, the Boast Building was the tallest building in Homestead at the time, and it was the one that was in closest proximity to what was happening at the pump house. And if you go up to the 3rd floor and look out the back windows, well, you can see exactly what they saw. And so that is another reason why we're a National Historic Landmark, is because the reporters filed all of those stories. So everything that you would read in the newspapers from 1892 about the battle and about the strike, they were primarily written from the vantage point of watching it at the Boast Building. Another location that's further out, so basically if you are in the mood for a drive, head out to a place called Rice's Landing. In Rice's Landing, we have yet another National Historic Landmark, which is called the W.A. Young & Sons Machine Shop. The W.A. Young & Sons Machine Shop is a fully intact foundry and blacksmith shop from the 1920s. It is one of those places, it's really a place that every historian dreams of finding. It's somebody left one day, and they locked it, and they walked away. And then when we came in, we unlocked it. It was exactly as it was when somebody left it 80 years ago. And in fact, when you go for a tour of the foundry, we can show you how it runs because it works. So if you have ancestors who, let's say if they were blacksmiths, or if you might see that they worked at a foundry, or even if they worked as a machinist, come see an environment in which they might have been working. So you can actually get up close and personal to these places. And sometimes, when we're doing this kind of records work, when we're looking at two-dimensional objects, and we are gleaning as much information as we possibly can from those pieces of paper, sometimes it's really helpful to actually take all of that and then go visit those physical sites if possible. And what's interesting about United States industrial history is that, by and large, it's very difficult to visit such spaces because when these places closed down in the 70s and 80s in particular, they were razed to the ground almost immediately, almost erased from the landscape, and then something else was built on top of it, namely the waterfront. It's fine. But really, though, sometimes just when you have time, go down to the waterfront, start at Sandcastle, and make your drive all the way through. Come all the way down to Lowe's. See how long it takes you to drive that. See the size of it. And then stop along the way and look at some of the remnants of the mills. So really, one of the things that Rivers of Steel is particularly adept at is environmental immersion. We can show you these environments, and we can help you build context around the lives that you're trying to reconstruct. So in addition to that, our museum is particularly excellent at putting together exhibits and other materials that draw from our large collections that have particularly local history in them. So what you will find in our archives, you will find collections that are mostly local and collections that come from a couple of places. Number one, our collections come from salvage. When big places close down, speaking of Heppenstall, Rivers of Steel might also be coming into possession of some records from Heppenstall fairly soon. So we'll see what's actually in them. We don't quite know the scope of what it is yet, but that's coming to us. So, salvage. Places close down. They call people in and say, hey, wrecking ball's outside. Take what you can carry. You have an hour. Go. So when you're wondering when records are incomplete, sometimes that's why. Sometimes they're incomplete because as fast as people can carry them out is as fast as a place is being demolished. So we get it from salvage. We also get our collections primarily from donations. And those donations are all local. They're all coming from people who live and who have lived and who have worked in the Monongahela River Valley primarily, although we do have records from people who have worked in the Ohio River Valley and the Allegheny River Valley, but primarily the Mon and primarily Homestead. Homestead, McKeesport, Munhall, Rankin, Swissvale, Braddock, and Duquesne. That's generally where people will donate. But what are they donating? Well, this is where our collection is particularly strong. They're giving us their memories. They're giving us their clothing. They're giving us hard hats. They're giving us their greens. They're giving us their silvers. They're giving us their gloves. They're giving us their glasses, They're giving us t-shirts. They're giving us sometimes socks, sure. They're giving us baseball uniforms, because did you know that basically every single mill in this entire region had their own baseball team? And sometimes, speaking of rate changes, sometimes people would get traded between mills because they're not going to work at a different mill because they have a skill that needs to be employed there. They're being traded to a different mill to play on the baseball team. And so their records will actually kind of track where they're going. And sometimes when you see, oh, why are they moving around so much? It might actually be because they're really good at baseball, they're really good at football, or they're really good at basketball, but primarily baseball. So our records, in particular, have those kinds of features. If you are looking for employee cards, we don't have many of those. To be perfectly honest with you, we have a single run of employee cards from the Duquesne Works, primarily from about 1917 to about 1950. They have been alphabetized, and that is about it. We have not scanned them, we have not digitized them. Right now they are sitting in archival boxes, and actually 2 of them are on the table back there. But we have, probably about 7,000 to 10,000 cards. And these are particularly interesting because they might track a person's entire career, and we have that. But those records are incomplete, they're very spotty, and they're not digitized. But if you want to come dig through them, you are more than welcome. But I will probably be plopping a few boxes right in front of you and saying, good luck. But we have things like that. But here are a few examples of things that we do have that might help you reconstruct the lives of people living and working in this region throughout the 19th and 20th century. So put this in your bucket along with the physical locations when you're trying to kind of give yourself a full picture. Think material culture. Cast your search far and wide. So start looking for things like safety posters. I mean, we know this job is dangerous. We've had a horrible reminder of that not even 24 hours ago. But did you know that mills had entire safety campaigns? And sometimes they were very funny. And this is the cleanest one that I could find. There were some that I thought were in very poor taste to bring, so I didn't. But everyone clean up all the time. Why would a poster from the 1950s be imploring someone to clean up? It's because it's a safety hazard. This particular poster is from a collection that we got from a little old lady named Minette Boot, who came to us one day with a box in hand and said, my husband, Jack Boot, was an illustrator for U.S. Steel for about 20 years. Do you want his prints? Yes, we do. So we have about 150 of them, ranging from about 1955 to about the late 70s. We have some, not a lot, but we have some employee photographs. And these are not, and these photographs are interesting because they are not official company photographs. These are not for their ID badges. This is actually just somebody's personal project that they happen to have a camera with them, and they happen to catch people as they're coming in and out of work, basically making them stand against the wall so they can snap a Polaroid of them. Some of these pictures have names. Some of these pictures, you can see this gentleman here, he's wearing his greens, he's wearing his hard hat. But notice how clean he is. He's not smudged up. That uniform is not dirty. You could probably tell from that photograph he hasn't been to work yet. Because if he had been coming from work, he would have been a lot dirtier than that. But we also have the same kinds of photographs of people coming out of work where they are barely recognizable as a human. You might see tiny little whites for their eyes, but everything else is smudged and covered. They're an incredible repository because it is a visual reminder of what the daily life of somebody, what it would have been like for them to actually go in and do the work. But it also shows you, okay, this is how the uniform gets worn. This is how the hat gets worn. And you'll notice a remarkable amount of personalization within that. Even in a company-issued uniform, you'll find that in the hard hats, they've got stickers all over them. So you'll be able to find out information about union affiliations, political affiliations, whose campaigns they happen to be supporting at the time, or people who are running for positions within the union. You might find information just by looking at a photograph like that. But these are not official company records. We also have smaller pieces, kind of like this piece right here, which I also have on the back table. And this is a union dues card. And this would actually give you a lot of information about how much any particular union was charging per month, if it was being taken out of their paycheck, if it was something that they just had to pay physically. But we have things like that. We also have tens of thousands of photographs, not from any specific mill. Well, we have them from specific mills, but we don't have enormous collections from, let's say, Duquesne, from Homestead, from Clareton, from Cary, from Edgar Thompson. We have them, and we have small pockets from each, primarily concentrated within the Monongahela River Valley. We have mechanical drawings. We have tens of thousands of mechanical drawings. So if, let's say, your ancestor was an engineer, we might have something that could give you a little bit of information about what an engineer would have been doing in a mill throughout the 20th century. We have things like that. But really, from our standpoint, what Rivers of Steel can do for you in your search is give you the context, give you the life, give you a snapshot into what people were doing, why they were doing it, and why they came here to do it. Why Pittsburgh? Out of anywhere else they could have gone, why did they come to this city? So we can help you with that. So first of all, I would suggest starting your archive search directly with us. Come to Rivers of Steel, go to riversofsteel.com, and then there will be a drop-down menu for our archives. Just start, I think Sierra's suggestion of playing with those search terms, that is an excellent suggestion that I am going to be stealing and using. Thank you. I think playing with those, plopping them into our search engine, will give you a place to start. Now, I'm going to recommend that you do not rely solely on what we have listed in our online holdings, because so much of what we have has not been digitized, and so much of what we have might not actually show up in your search. But if you put in that search and you can find some approximations, that's a place to start. So I would pair that search and the information you can glean from that with an appointment directly with us. Please come see us. If you email archives@riversofsteel.com, that will get you to one of our archivists, and we can start pulling information for you, make an appointment, and then come and see us. Once you pair that with the records that you might find just on a search from our website, it's a good place to start. But what I would primarily encourage you to do is come to our physical locations and see it for yourself. Because I think in constructing their lives, what better than to actually go to the place where they actually did the work. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic, Kirsten. Thank you so much. So our final speaker for this evening is Zachary Brote, and I'd like to welcome him to the stage. Zachary is University Archivist and Records Manager for the University of Pittsburgh Library Systems Archives and Special Collections Department. He has also managed many of their labor and industrial collections for over 15 years. Zach is a council member of the Pennsylvania Historical Association and the author of a 2023 book, From the Steel City to the White City, Western Pennsylvania and the World's Columbian Exposition. It is not every day that you see an archivist publishing a book, so congratulations to you, Zach, and welcome.
All right. Thank you, Sierra. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Like the others, I'm going to kind of start with some background contextual information for why exactly Pitt has all this stuff. Basically, in the 1960s, early 1960s, Pitt's history faculty decided that they were going to seek out records that document the lives and experiences of the communities that were springing up after the Civil War as industry really kind of took hold here in Pittsburgh. And their goal was to find collections that would kind of fill these archival gaps or silences of kind of like the everyday person. And so what results from that are collections about steelworkers, but also ethnic and fraternal organizations, activists, a whole lot of activists, politicians, other groups of people that were active in Pittsburgh at this time. So if you don't see the mill that maybe your ancestors worked with in the collections I'm going to go through, don't be discouraged, because we probably do have at least one collection that had touched their lives and documents their lives in some way. When you're looking at my slides here, you're going to see a weird number that starts with AIS. That's the collection number. So if you go to our website or if you go to historicpittsburgh.org and you punch that number in, what that's going to do is it's going to bring up the collection guide. It's an inventory of all the, at least the folders that are in that collection. These are also in the handout. This is the best way to get to a specific collection that we're talking about. Like Sierra, I'm going to start with the Jones and Laughlin stuff because that's why we're here, right? So we also have a collection of Jones and Laughlin material documenting the workers that were in Hazelwood and over in the South Side. I'm going to start with something a little bit different, payroll ledgers. So this collection has ledgers that were microfilmed, and these are about a few of the different departments that were within that J&L mill. And so this one is specific to the beehive coke ovens. And you'll see that on this page, they're documenting the workers, not alphabetically by name, but they're grouping them up by like what their job title was, or they're calling it their occupation there. And then on this page, they're showing the hours that they worked in a 15-day period. So you'll see that first gentleman actually worked 12 hours a day for 15 days straight. And we'll see what his rate was per hour and what his earnings were for that particular 15-day period. We do also have wage rate cards like Kate talked about. So again, these are a little bit different than the ones that have been digitized from the Heinz History Center, but they really do go well together. So if you find your ancestor on the Ancestry collection, please feel free to contact us, because chances are we'll probably have a card too. On the few that I've kind of looked for in both places, they did have cards in both spots, but they do have some different information. So in this case, we see this gentleman's, the department where he worked, the byproduct ovens. We see his actual occupation as being the coke spillage man, his wage rate. The same gentleman's card that's on Ancestry provides more actually information about his family and where he was born, when he was born, his wife's name, that kind of thing. So I want to echo Kate's suggestion that you really do search both places when you're looking at these wage rate cards. We do have a few other Jones and Laughlin collections at Pitt, including another one that documents the Pittsburgh works. This one's focused more on the late 19th century. And again, these are microfilmed ledgers. And this one is maybe not as helpful for a couple of reasons. The handwriting is a little bit worse. It's that really great, like, scribbly Victorian era handwriting that all the genealogists know and love. It was also they were damaged when they were microfilmed in the 1970s, and so you'll notice a lot of like really dark edges, and it's really kind of hard to see a lot of the material that's on each page. Another thing is the way they're organized, though they are organized by department. So you kind of have to have a sense of like where your ancestor worked in the mill before these really become helpful, because they're really difficult to just kind of browse through them. We do also have a small collection of wage rate cards from the Aliquippa works, maybe a couple hundred, and they're very specific to the 1950s and the 1960s. One nice feature about these, though, is that you'll notice there's a staple in the corner of this particular one. If a person's job changed, if their wage rate changed during the 50s and 60s, they were nice enough to staple their cards together, so you don't have to fish through like the entire box to try to find everyone related to your ancestor, which is nice. Usually the staples aren't even rusted, so that's always good. Kate also mentioned some of the difficulty that comes with working with particularly U.S. Steel folks, because that company still exists, and in some cases, like Edgar Thomson Works, Clairton, Irvin, those plants still exist. And so the records for those individual workers are probably not publicly available. Fortunately for us, though, for the mills that are no longer around, a lot of those records have been captured by the various archives in the area, including the Heinz History Center and the University of Pittsburgh. We have a large collection of basically employee records from the U.S. Steel's National Works or the National Tube Works, depending on what area you're looking at, in McKeesport. This is one of those instances where the plant was closed. They left these records behind. And as the wrecking ball was coming through, they asked Pitt if we were interested. And so our archivists went on site and salvaged what they could, documenting the workforce specifically. This is the collection that has the World War II National Defense Program cards. So these are probably our most frequently requested genealogical materials relating to steelworkers. This is a sample card here. So there's a lot of great information. I think the best one is at the bottom of the card. It has scars and like other identifying marks. It's always fun to see how they're describing like tattoos from the 1940s. I really enjoy that. But these were used basically for background checks on people working or applying to work on National Defense Program projects at the mill. So it's not uncommon to see multiple cards for the same employee. If you're lucky, there will be a thumbnail photograph of the employee, and then on the back of every one of these, you actually get to see your ancestors' fingerprints, which are really, really cool. We do also have some workers' compensation and accident files, so you kind of get a sense on those of life in the mill and kind of the dangers of working at National Tube. The pension files, not so much information about like the nitty-gritty of like pension payouts themselves. What they really are, though, they're the work histories of those individuals. A lot of the times the work history at National Tube, but if they came from another U.S. Steel facility, sometimes it'll include that documentation too, which is really nice. The employee registers are pretty much the payroll spreadsheets again. These are maybe not as helpful as you would like them to be. They were used inconsistently, and a lot of the workers are listed by their employee or their check number. And so the check number it's not an arbitrary number. It does kind of map to where they worked in the mill. Unfortunately, we don't have like the key to decode that for this particular mill, but we do have that for the next collection, the Duquesne Works. So if we see somebody's employee number from the Duquesne Works, we can look at that key. I think it's from the 40s or the early 50s, and we can know what part of the mill they were working in at that time. This is another set of records that were left behind, specific to the Industrial Relations Department. So in addition to capturing information about the workforce, it also has a lot of like public relations materials, and they're talking about things like naturalizing immigrant workers so they can have access to more wartime money to work on war projects, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of really good research material here. Again, we see the payroll ledgers. These are the employee cards that Kate showed they're basically one long form that they then fold into three. So they kind of serve like a little packet of information, and then they stuff inside about as much documentation as humanly possible. That goes everything from like vacation requests, changes in job, changes in wages, everything in between is stuffed in papers here. These employee cards can document longtime workers that have been there for decades. They can also capture people who were there just for the summer. So this is actually a card for a student employee. I know it's hard to see, but if you squint your eyes there on the long one, his past job experience, he was a caddy at Green Valley Golf Club, and he worked at Kennywood for a while in the 1940s. So tradition, right? This one also shows that he is the third generation in his family to work at this particular plant. His father is a current employee at Duquesne Works, and his grandfather is listed as being a pensioner. So make sure you're kind of covering everybody when you're looking at these records, because you never know where that ancestor that you're actually looking for might kind of sneak into their employee record. Grievance files, again, we do have grievance files for the Duquesne Works. These are typically organized by the mill department, and so it's a little bit difficult to find specific individuals, but these are the best place to learn about what it's like to be on the shop floor, what are they experiencing, what are the issues that they're running into as they're producing product. The AM Buyers Company cards are very similar to the employee records in the Duquesne Works. And again, these are trifolds that contain all that really good information kind of stuffed inside. On the union side, we do have some union records for the steelworkers at Pitt. These really pick up starting in 1937. That is when the Steelworkers Organizing Committee really kind of digs in and start to organize a lot of the plants in the region. This is where we see the shift from craft unionism, where they're kind of taking a skilled set of workers and organizing them group by group. That didn't work out so well, so now they shift to industrial unionism, where they're going to organize the entire plant. So keeping with our J&L theme here, that's our largest United Steelworkers collection, is a local that was active at the J&L Pittsburgh Works. We do have some membership cards in this case from 1937 through 54. I picked a 37 one because this kind of shows you that transition from the craft unionism to industrial unionism, because we see on the card it says Amalgamated Association. At the top, it references the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, which eventually becomes the United Steelworkers of America. So we get to see those kind of iterations as we go. So this individual, if it's from 1937, was probably one of the earliest union members at that J&L facility. We do also have meeting minutes from this particular local right up until the mill closes. And so if you have relatives that were there in the 80s, in the 90s, and you want a kind of better understanding of what the workers were feeling as things are kind of like coming down around them, the minutes are a really great place to look at that. We also have job descriptions for this local as well. A few other United Steelworker locals whose papers we have. Unfortunately, none of these have membership cards, but we do have another collection of J&L materials specific to the works on the south side. We have some from the U.S. Steel's Homestead Works. A lot of this stuff in our collection is from the early years. There's another collection at Indiana University of Pennsylvania's archives that brings you kind of up to the 70s and the 80s. So it's good to look at both places there. We also have one for Lockhart Iron and Steel in McKees Rocks, and Universal Cyclops in Bridgeville. Kate talked about the Allegheny County Coroner's inquest files earlier. This is probably maybe the most helpful collection that we have that is like not specifically related to steelworkers. But anybody in Allegheny County who died suddenly or suspiciously may have an inquest record in this collection. And again, this is from 1884 through 1976. There is a small gap in the like 1933 to 36 where they're missing, but we have some morgue reports from that time period, so we can at least see names, we can see causes of death, that kind of thing. Each coroner file has at least 3 pieces of paper in it. It has basically a press release that kind of gives you the summary of the incident. There's an affidavit from somebody identifying the individual, and then there's the coroner's jury verdict. So if their name exists, you know you'll at least get 3 pieces of paper with really great genealogical information on it. But it's not uncommon to have, especially in a case of like a mill accident, to have testimony from others that were in the area to kind of get a better sense of what happened during that particular incident. I happened upon this one by accident, but it's actually a really great example. So this was somebody who was involved in a mill accident actually at J&L Aliquippa, so outside of Allegheny County. But to get medical treatment, he was brought to Pittsburgh for a hospital here, and then he died in Pittsburgh. And so there is an Allegheny coroner's report for him, and then the verdict mentions that they're kind of deferring to Beaver County to follow up on the investigation. Like Kate mentioned, these can get a little bit graphic at times in their description. Occasionally, coroner files will include a photograph or like a reenactment of an injury, especially like Carnegie Steel did that for a while. They kind of reenacted incidents, and then they photographed those, and they were part of the evidence in the coroner's file. There's not like an index available online, but if you contact us with the name of your ancestor and the date of their death, we can search our index for you and see if we do have a file for them. But there's about 250,000 people represented in this collection. Another collection that we have that is about steel, but not specific steel workers, is the William Gaughan collection. William Gaughan worked at the Homestead Works from 1947 to 1983. He was also really interested in just the history of steel making, the history of steel in Western Pennsylvania, and specifically Homestead, where he worked. And so he collected a lot of materials as he was working there, as the plant was starting to kind of wind down operations. And what we have are a lot of records that are documenting mostly steel production, particularly at Homestead. But the great part about the William Gaughan collection is that he collected a lot of photographs that were taken inside the mill. So the photos in my presentation tonight are all from the William Gaughan collection. And those photos cover a period from like 1890 through 1970. So you can really see the evolution of not just steel-making processes, but safety equipment, that kind of thing. And you get a sense of like the scale of steel production at Homestead. On the bottom of my slide and in the handout, I've provided the URL that goes right to the page that has all of William Gaughan's photographs from his collection. But if you go to Historic Pittsburgh, this collection is there, in addition to a lot of other photographs of steelworks. That's where you can find maps of all the mill towns. The city directories from Pittsburgh and Homestead are all there as well. So that's a really great jumping off point, because then it also has the collection guides to not only our collections, but also the ones here at the Heinz History Center. In addition to records that we have specifically pertaining to steelworkers, we also do have a number of collections documenting steel company operations. So I've listed a few of them here, and I just want to highlight a couple. Henry Clay Frick's business papers are at the University of Pittsburgh. So his work with Carnegie Steel, Frick Coke Company, which directly feeds into the steel industry out here. All of his business records are at Pitt. And so they provide a really great example of what it's like to be a senior administrator at a steel mill. If you had an ancestor that was like a mill manager or worked in those kinds of offices for a steel company in Pittsburgh, I would recommend taking a look at Frick's, they called them letterpress copybooks, basically copies of his outgoing correspondence, because he's corresponding with a lot of these other local companies, and so chances are he may have corresponded with your ancestor if they were working as a senior administrator for one of these other companies. It's also a great peek behind the scenes at how Carnegie Steel was actually run, which I find really fascinating. We mentioned the Battle of Homestead, the strike of 1892. Frick's papers are a great resource of finding newspaper articles about the strike, but then also his correspondence with Carnegie, Pinkerton, and some others along the way. The William Martin papers just below him also kind of document the strike, because he was the head of the Bureau of Labor for Carnegie Steel in the 1890s. And kind of as they're leading up to 1892 and the end of the contract with the union, he took it upon himself to collect a bunch of data from steelworks throughout the country on the wages that they were paying to specific kinds of workers. And those spreadsheets are in this collection. So if you know that you have a relative that worked for a particular company and they had a particular job in the 1890s, there's a good chance that William Martin probably has the average wage for that particular job in his collection. We do also, though, have some records from Oliver Iron and Steel, American Sheet Tin Plate. We have some, not necessarily records from Crucible Steel, but safety training films and slides. So if you want to see how they're trying to teach their steelworkers to be a little bit safer, that's a great collection for you. Fort Pitt Bridge Works is a little bit older than some of the other collections, which could be interesting. That is on microfilm. And then there is a little bit on Macintosh Hempel as well. So again, to search any of our collections, both the finding aids or the finding guides to our collections and digitized material, you can visit our website, which is on the slide, or you can go to historicpittsburgh.org. If you would like to reach out to me directly with any specific questions, if you want to know if we have a card, in a collection for your ancestor, feel free to contact me directly. Most of them are alphabetized. I can check it within a few minutes. But I really appreciate you all coming out again tonight, and I hope that we have some records at Pitt that will be helpful to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach, and to all of our speakers. So we're going to take a couple minutes to roll through some questions here. I have to say, this is like such a robust array of questions that are like beautifully built off of all of our remarks, so I'm so appreciative to y'all. The first questions I'm going to direct towards Kate, our main speaker. So the first question relates to historic photographs. This person is interested in how to go about finding old photos that relate to your ancestors specifically. So individual strategies on finding relevant photos.
So there's a couple of different ways to do this. I think the first and best way is to explore newspaper records to see if there just happens to be a newspaper article about your ancestor with an associated photograph. This isn't, specific to Steele itself, but for example, my own family, I found a photograph of my great-grandfather when he got 50 dogs to move to his farm in McDonald, PA, which is very bizarre, but that photograph didn't know it was out there, was able to find it through newspaper records. And if you're particularly looking at a steel worker who, say, worked at like Duquesne Works or the Woodworks in McKeesport, the McKeesport Heritage Center and Regional Archives does have the daily news from McKeesport within their record collections. And I know there are a lot of beautiful photographs within those newspaper records of the goings-on with the local mills. And those have not been digitized, to my knowledge, and are available online. Another thing that you can do, which is just like genealogy specific, is if you do have an Ancestry subscription, to connect with relatives online and identify if they have any photographs of an ancestor, and try to get photographs that way. And of course, looking through these archival collections that we've talked about tonight can be a great resource.
Thank you so much, Kate. And just to piggyback off of that, if you take the approach of searching by the plant, sometimes you do come across group photographs of steelworkers where those individuals are identified on the back of the photograph, but their names aren't transcribed into the catalog record, into the finding aid in a way that it would pop up in a search of our catalogs. So excellent. Another attendee mentions that they have an ancestor who died and unfortunately was incinerated in an explosion at J&L's Eliza furnace in 1907. This person is interested in what kind of benefits, if any, would have been provided to the family at the time.
So my understanding of the law at the time and what happened is there would have been minimal benefits available to the family. There was almost an assumption of risk when you were employed in these industries that they could be quite dangerous. And additionally, this individual passed away in 1907, and the first federal workers' compensation law wasn't passed until 1915. And as a result of that federal workers' compensation law, the first Bureau of Workers' Compensation in Pennsylvania was established the first year, or that year, so it wasn't enacted into law to really have to provide those benefits until a little bit later. So I don't think the family likely got anything. That's also at a time in American history where it's unlikely that they would have pursued litigation against the steel company. In some scenarios outside of steel and coal mining, I have seen litigation for accidents initiated by a living individual who was injured at that time, but it's not something that I've seen in steel. Somebody else might be able to provide some additional insights, but that's my perspective.
Thank you, Kate. And then I have one more question for you. This is a wonderful segue to the next iteration of our series. So someone very helpfully asked, can the methodology that Kate walked through be applied to researching coal mining ancestors as well? So I will pitch that to you.
The methodology certainly can be applied to coal mining ancestor with some caveats. A lot of times, coal miners lived in rural areas that were remote. So some records that we talked about to identify where somebody worked, like a city directory record, is not going to work for a coal mining ancestor because city directories probably weren't taken in the jurisdiction in which they lived. It can also be difficult to identify precisely where your ancestor worked just by the concept of company towns, that sometimes these towns were unincorporated, so you're going to have to research the town as well as the employer and sort of link those two together to get where exactly your ancestor worked. But the rest of the methodology is very similar, and it's something that in the future I'm excited to talk to everybody about.
And the next iteration in this series on researching your blue-collar ancestors will be focused on your coal miners and your family. And we're looking to early 2026 for that program. So be sure to sign up for the History Center's mailing list. Thank you, Kate. I'm going to bring Kirsten up next. A couple questions for her. The first question relates to just general practices historically around hiring. Was there generally a minimum age for steelworkers? And did that change over time?
It's very difficult to determine somebody's young age because they can lie about it. And with birth records being incredibly inconsistent, and identification records being incredibly inconsistent, it's very easy for someone to claim that they're older than they actually are. Hiring practices pretty much extended into somebody's teens. So we have evidence of people working in mills as young as 12, 13, and 14. But it was pretty standard practice for even younger children to be working in some of these sort of supportive positions within the mills, center sweepers, water carriers, errand boys, messengers, and they could be even younger, sometimes as young as 9 and 10. Certainly not as young as, speaking of coal mines, certainly not as young as what you'd find with workers in coal mines, but certainly hiring practices were as young as they could conceivably get away with within reason. Those practices absolutely changed over time with the passage of child labor laws and standardization of birth records made it more difficult for companies to rely on child labor. But it is certainly a widespread practice within the industry that carried through until probably about World War II.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And then another question about general practices in these individual mills. So this person is a granddaughter of a Slovak immigrant who worked at Crucible Steel from the 1940s to the 1960s. This person's wondering specifically about safety practices and thinking about, we know based on the records that most immigrants, or many immigrants, may not have been conversant in English or have spoken the language. So how were safety instructions and other key information communicated in those instances?
That's a fantastic question. And it actually has a couple of different answers because it also depends on whether or not somebody was literate. Just because somebody could or could not speak English doesn't mean that they could read or write in their language, of course. So throughout steel mills, it's not uncommon to see safety signs written in 7 or 8 different languages. So you might have, we have in our archives and actually displayed in some of our locations, we have safety signs where danger will be written in English, but then the word danger will be translated into 6 or 7 different languages. Everything from Greek, I think there's one that has Greek, Italian, Russian, Ukrainian, Slovakian, German, and Czech on it. And it's just transcribed all the way through. So even if you can't read English, there is a chance that you might be able to read it. Now, if you could not read or write, or you could not speak English, it's also not uncommon for mills to develop kind of a physical language, sign language, that no matter what language you spoke, something that you could understand. And it's also not uncommon for laborers in particular, people who are actually doing the grunt work in these locations, to be working in groups with people that just do not speak their language at all. So within a labor gang of 10 or 12 people, you might have maybe 2 or 3 who speak the same language. So you'll see the development of sign language. Things like means go ahead or go forward, that, stop, or stop, slow down. You might see things like that. And safety procedures certainly evolved over time. In the early days of the industry, safety was not something anybody cared about at all. So communication of any kind of danger was usually just done by hand gestures and shouting. As you get through into the 20th century with passages of laws that were intended to create safety nets and were designed to create ways for people to protect themselves, you'll start to see more PPE. So you'll start to see the widespread use of hard hats and goggles and gloves and things like that. But that doesn't become standard usage until the 30s and 40s. So it won't be unusual for you to be looking at a photograph from the turn of the last century and see people having no safety equipment. And you can reasonably assume that probably a lot of those people in those photographs don't speak the same language as each other. So you're looking for, in backgrounds of photographs or in other documentation, translations even within those signage, and you're looking for examples of somebody making physical gestures.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And then this is another great question for you, and then I'll let you go. What resources or organizations are out there for individuals wishing to contribute to archives, whether that be oral histories or records relating to their families? This person's also interested in volunteer opportunities. So if you want to answer that on behalf of Rivers of Steel.
Rivers of Steel. Really, one of our strongest collections is, in fact, our oral history collection. Some of them have been digitized, and really only a handful have been digitized because our oral history activities go back to the 1980s. So we have several hundred, actually probably closer to 1,000 or more, oral histories that we have collected throughout the decades. Some of them have been digitized, some of them have not. Some of them still exist on cassette tapes, and in fact, I think I might have seen an 8-track or 2. So once we get those digitized, those will become more widely available. We do have some that have been digitized that you can have access to, and we are always open and welcoming to anybody who has a direct experience in the industry or has grown up in places like Homestead or Munhall or Rankin or Swissvale or any of the, particularly the Mon Valley. If you have experience or if you know somebody who has experience and you would like to talk to us, we would love to collect your oral history and have it in our repository because most of what we have, it is all local. And then volunteer opportunities, yes, we have those. We have so many of those. We have a pretty, if you send me an email, and my contact information is, you can get to me through the handout, but I also have other contact information for you. I can put you in touch with people who do, if you like being outside and you want to do some work at Cary, we have that. We also have opportunities for folks to help us in the archives just by basic processing and things like that. So if you're interested, please do get in touch with us because we always love having volunteers. Also, if you want to learn how to give a tour, I'll teach you that too. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And I think I hope you've seen tonight that it really does take a village as far as different archives, museums, and repositories that have different focuses that can join together to preserve and help share out the history of this region from various facets, perspectives, but particularly the steel industry in this instance. So it's also, we at the History Center would love to engage in conversation. Us as archivists are often in the business of just learning more about a collection and then thinking through where's the best home for it. it. So I think, generally keeping that in mind, we're here to help. I'm going to invite Zach up. I have a question for him, and then one that I hope will be answered along the walk. So somebody asks about good records or sources information for Crucible Steel Company. You highlighted the training films that are in Pitt's collection. I also want to mention that the Beaver County Industrial Museum has great resources on Crucible Steel Company records, as well as individual artifacts that are on display. So I definitely want to reiterate Kate's highlight of that wonderful resource that's in Darlington, Pennsylvania in Beaver County. Anything to add on that, or are you good? Yeah, I figured. Okay. Then a question, is there a listing of steelworker unions that lists local unions and their addresses? Then there's a little bit more detail there, but generally I think that's a good question for folks to get insight into.
So at Pitt, we have a collection of their copies of, they call them organizer reports, but it's basically like the application for a steelworkers union to get started, dating from 1937 to about 1944. And and this covers geographically most of Western Pennsylvania, if not a little bit further east. So I think, if you're trying to track down a Pennsylvania steel local, I would say contact me, and I can easily, give me the information that you have, and I'll see what I can do. And also, Penn State is the official repository for the United Steelworkers Archives. So if I'm not able to find something, hopefully they'll have a resource that they'll be able to point you towards where we can track that down.
Thank you so much, Zach. I really appreciate it. And then we have an incredible array of questions around individual mills and where those records might be. I'm going to roll through those really quickly because I was able to do some research. So someone was interested in the Rockwell plants in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. We have some documentation at the History Center of a project to document and tell the story of Rockwell over time. So not necessarily employee files, really looking and zooming out at the Rockwell story. We do have those materials that are open for research. Additionally, like I mentioned, we have Heppenstall Steel Mill records, more from the vantage point of the corporation and the Heppenstall family. That's the family that donated the records to us. But there are some insights into the 1937 strike, and it sounds like Rivers of Steel is a good place to hit up for some Heppenstall steel materials as well. And then let's see, was that everything? I think so. Related to individual companies. Ambridge, American Bridge Company. So we do have some American Bridge Company materials as well. So again, please feel free to reach out to us. And then a great segue, a question to dig into is how do folks wonder, how do we get access to non-digitized records at the History Center? So use your handout and look in particular via our online catalog. You can do keyword searching. Again, search the names of those companies, those plants, those beneficial organizations. Reach out to us via our online appointment form. We are more than happy to do some work behind the scenes to support your research, and then make an appointment to come and visit us. I think y'all have been so gracious, so I'm going to close it down. But thank you so much to our audience, as well as our wonderful, wonderful speakers for all of their insightful answers. I want to take a moment and also thank my colleagues at the History Center for their role in assisting me with this event. We really ask that you consider taking a moment and completing our survey. We value your feedback and are always eager to learn more about how we can continue to enhance our programs, especially launching a new series. For folks in person, your surveys are in the back of your folder. We have pens available at the History Center table. Once you've completed them, you could just leave them at your chair. For virtual folks, a link to the survey is going to be dropped into the chat, and it'll also be available via follow-up email. Thank you all so much again for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.